Joining us now, president and founder of the Eurasia Group and G0 Media, Ian Bremmer. Thank you so much for being here. All right, so there's a lot going on right now. There's the president talking to Zelensky. You know, Vladimir Putin is pushing in on Ukraine. There's also the EU elections. Can you walk us through what you are watching in this moment?
Not as much from the EU. Certainly, the far right is going to outperform. They'll end up with more seats. But let's keep in mind that Giorgia Meloni, who's the most recognizable and powerful figure there, the Italian prime minister, is a strong supporter of the EU, pretty close with Ursula von der Leyen, who runs the European Commission, and also a strong opponent of Putin's Russia and wants to continue to provide support for Ukraine. So I don't see any big change from the EU. Also, I mean, the last few weeks have generally been good for NATO on Ukraine, in part because there's coordination, in part because they're taking more risks. Remember, you now have the US and lots of other countries that are talking about allowing the Ukraine to target military targets inside Ukraine with NATO weaponry. Soon, you're going to have trainers on the ground for aircraft and other NATO equipment in Ukraine itself. And you're going to have tens of billions of dollars of additional money given to Ukraine that comes from the frozen, soon-to-be seized assets of Russia. That's a lot of coordination that's supporting the Ukrainians that you didn't have a few weeks ago, Katie. But all of that comes at a cost of potentially increasing the risk, certainly increasing the direct engagement of NATO in this war.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that. So NATO and the U.S. are now allowing Ukraine to hit military targets in Russia, but they're on the border of Ukraine. They're not allowing them to go much further. President Zelensky seemed to want to update President Biden maybe on some of that. Or is he arguing for more approval, more access to go deeper into Russia and potentially stronger weaponry?
He certainly is, and he is in part because, of course, the Russians are able to target Ukraine across their territory. It's civilian targets that they're hitting. It's not just energy infrastructure, which has been severely damaged in Ukraine over the past weeks, and that's going to hurt them in the winter coming up. But, of course, it's also terrorizing civilians because they're hitting targets in urban centers, irrespective of whether they are military or not. And the Ukrainians are saying if they can do that, we need to be able to hit Russian military targets across Russia. They don't have the approval to do that with NATO weaponry. What's going to happen going forward? Why is NATO doing things? I mean, Katie, if you and I were having this conversation 3 years ago before the Russian invasion, and we talked about the fact that there was a possible scenario where NATO would be engaged against Russia in a proxy war like this, and they'd be providing sort of the ability of the Ukrainians to launch weapons directly into Russia, that the Americans, the Europeans would all be in favor of that, you'd say not only is that crazy, you'd say it's incredibly dangerous. And yet that's where we are. So how did we get here? And the answer is, number one, because Russia's deterrence has not stood up very well. Putin says a lot of things. You know, he threatens the Nordics. If you join NATO, there's going to be hell to pay. They join NATO, nothing happens. He says, you know, if you keep providing weapons, we're going to hit you. They do it. He doesn't hit them. So we're getting more comfortable with it. And of course, every incremental step you make over a couple of years, it feels like, oh, well, guess we can do that. Let's take the next small step. So it's not like one big jump. But also, Katie, because the war has not gone well over the past few months for Ukraine, and Biden apologized for some of that. Some of that is American political dysfunction. Some of that is a lack of Ukrainian troops that are trained on the front lines. It's a small country. It's a democracy. Russia can send a lot more troops against Ukraine. And some of it is a lack of air defense. Just literally the material doesn't exist unless you take it away from other countries. You put all of that together, that has made NATO more willing, maybe more desperate, but certainly more willing to take risks on that heretofore would have been considered too dangerous.
It would have been an insane conversation to have. You wouldn't want to trigger Article 5. Let me ask you about the Russian sending a nuclear missile frigates and warships, nuclear subs to Cuba. Should we be worried about that? Should we be worried about that?
Well, we shouldn't like it because, of course, it's not standard operating procedure for the Russians over the last couple decades. On the other hand, of course, the United States is by far the most powerful military in the world, and the U.S. sends its most advanced armaments on military exercises right off the Chinese border, right off the Russian border, like it happens all the time. So, I mean, in that regard, the Russians aren't doing anything that the Americans don't do, and it would not be useful to panic over that. But, you know, there is this sense that Russia's increasingly taking acts that are themselves dangerous. And while they're not going to send tanks into Poland anytime soon or the Baltic states, you know, there have been cyber attacks by Russia, by criminal actors in Russia that Putin's certainly aware of and allowing, for example, against critical infrastructure, water facilities in the U.S., France, Poland. We're also seeing a lot of arson in Europe, against Eastern Europe, against industrial facilities that look to have, some of them at least, Russian fingerprints on them. Those are things that are dangerous. Those were considered a red line by Biden back when he met with Putin in Geneva 3 years ago, in the days of the Russian cyber attacks on the Colonial Pipeline. So there are already things that are happening that are much more dangerous between the United States, between NATO, and the world's largest nuclear power, Putin's Russia.
Ian Bremmer. Ian, thank you very much. I really appreciate the context, much needed context in moments like these.